because this is my July of 2019 wrap up for all the books that I've read. I have read 9 books this month. I actually had a decent reading month. Like, it wasn't like a bunch of 5 stars like it has been like the last few months, but I did really enjoy what I read. This month was more of a 4-star month for me. I had a couple of 5 stars and I had a 3.75 star, but overall, I mean, it was still a good reading month. I still enjoyed pretty much everything that I read. So we're just gonna go ahead and get into the wrap up. At the beginning of the month, I binge listened to an audiobook. It was Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. This is a book like that I've heard a lot of good things about. A lot of people really love this book. I loved the audiobook. It was narrated by Will Wheaton. I have never in my life binged an audiobook before, and I somehow ended up binging this one. It was just, I remember I watched the movie and I loved the movie. The movie is good, but the book adds so much more to it because Wade Watts, our main character, starts out in high school. In the movie, he starts out considerably older and he is already outside of school. So we really don't get to see a ton of stuff regarding how he was attending schools or, you know, like how he got started, like, you know, even from a disadvantaged life. This kind of explained everything that I could possibly have wanted in this. It was so amazing. The movie itself kind of does go along with the book in overall idea, but when it comes to all the details, the real story was in the details, and I was completely immersed in this. This book actually takes place in the year 2044 when everything has just been ecologically terrible. People are starving. There's been a long-term recession. There's even a 2-year waiting list for McDonald's if you were trying to get a job. I mean, everybody is just suffering. Well, there's this world called the Oasis, which is an MMORPG, a multiplayer online role-playing game, and it stretches to the entire world. So anybody from anywhere can play it. There is this competition Holiday had set up, who is the creator of this after he died, that the person to find all of the Easter eggs and all 3 of the keys and unlocks everything will be able to inherit the Oasis along with all of his fortune. Holiday was a very awkward person, so he didn't like really have a lot of friends or family. He never had a wife. His entire life revolved around the Oasis. So this is kind of like a competition for everybody to really try to get those keys so that they can inherit the Oasis, because it also allows them rights over the Oasis. Gunters are the ones who actually try to get these keys, and these keys are also being sought after by a corporation called IOI, who also wants to own everything having to do with the Oasis and wants complete rights over it. Well, IOI, one of the worries about IOI getting it is that they're going to completely destroy it. They're going to start charging for things that normally wouldn't be charged, and things are going to get even worse. So there's a race to try to see who is going to end up inheriting the Oasis. This was wonderful. It was well detailed. The world that was created for us was extremely immersive, and this is actually one of my 5 out of 5 stars for the month of July, because I just never have I ever binged a audiobook before and felt so immersed, especially for a story that I already kind of knew how it was going to end. So the fact that I already had an idea about how this was going to end and I was still at the edge of my seat listening to it, I think really says something about how wonderfully immersive this book is. The next book that I read is Things My Son Needs to Know About the World by Fredrik Backman. This is actually Fredrik Backman's first nonfiction book. It is a very short book. There's not a lot to it. It's a very quick read, but it's extremely funny. So this was basically a letter to Fredrik Backman's son that he wrote, trying to express to him, you know, like things about the world, things about life. And he was doing it in very physical ways, and he was using humor to kind of express that. So for example, one of the things that you don't know about parents is like that they become extremely obsessed with poop. They get poop everywhere because like they're having to deal with the newborn baby. They're extremely obsessed with poop. I know that doesn't sound super funny, but in context, it's freaking hilarious. There's also like a lot of things like that go back and forth, like with prenatal nurses. And one of the things like that I really take away from like this too is he kind of sets up like one of his conversations in IKEA, and he says that an argument in IKEA is never really about IKEA itself, which really stuck with me because it kind of, you know, like leads you to believe that, yeah, because IKEA is kind of like about life and building your life. And so like if you don't know what kind of cabinets your wife likes, oh honey, you don't even know me at all. So I mean, there was like a lot of really cool things to this. I never read anything by Frederick Bachman before. This was my first introduction to him, but this has really inspired me to try to get to his really popular books such as Beartown. I really enjoyed this. This was an amazing book. It was actually my other 5 out of 5 stars, and this was both right at the beginning of the month because I do talk about these in the order that I read them. So from here on out, we have some that are a little bit less than 5 stars. Actually, I take that back. I had 3 5 stars in the month of July. So my third 5-star was Aqua Cove by Katie O'Neill. This is the same lady that wrote the Tea Dragon Society, and I had been wanting to read this for quite a while. This was a very cute novel. It's a graphic novel. It has the same exact artwork that you would find in the Tea Dragon Society, and I really, really enjoyed this. This was not as immersive in dragon type figures or the aquacorns as we know them because this is next to the sea, but it does discuss a lot about how our aquacorns are being harmed because of pollution. So this really does touch on a very serious subject on how a lot of wildlife in the ocean is dying due to pollution, and that even a small town that they live in can really make a difference in this. I thought these messages were very important to the overall story. It's a very important message in a very cutesy setting, so it's really good as far as reaching a younger audience. But once again, I really think that these books are for all ages, and I just really enjoyed this. So last year I read The Kiss Quotient, and that is one of my favorite books of all time. I absolutely love that book. So I finally got around to reading The Freid Test by Helen Hong. This was actually considered The Kiss Quotient Part 2. You have our 2 main characters, Esme and Kai. Esme is actually in Vietnam, and this lady comes over and says, hey, I'm looking for a wife for my husband. You can come for the next couple of months. We'll see if you guys hit it off. And if you do, then you're going to be married by the end of the 2 months. Little does this lady know that Esme has a daughter from a previous relationship that she had that went very poorly. And so she is having to think about her daughter and the well-being of her daughter. Because at first she tells this lady, no, I don't think this is a good idea. And then she starts thinking about the well-being of her daughter and how she'd be able to get her daughter over to America if she agrees to this. So she calls the lady back and says, okay, we'll go ahead and do this. Well, Kai is very socially awkward. He's autistic. He has high functioning autism. He's an accountant, and he is very numbers oriented. His mother, Ko Nong, actually is the one who's bringing Esme over from Vietnam to the States to see how her and her son hit it off. Kai was a very cutesy character, but overall, this was not my favorite out of the 2 books. I was hoping to have the same amount of love for this couple that I did for the couple in The Kiss Quotient, but unfortunately it fell kind of short for me. So this relationship was not very much grounded in affection and love. I did not feel the love radiating off of this couple whatsoever, which was my biggest problem with it. I kind of felt like it was more out of convenience, and he was kind of discovering his sexuality, which is really good, and I really liked that aspect of it. But at the same time, it just felt like it left me feeling a little bit cold because I didn't feel like it was as affectionate as it was in The Kiss Quotient. The Kiss Quotient, in spite of the fact that it was, not supposed to be love, it was supposed to be gritty, Michael was always very considerate. He was always very caring, very loving, and I felt like Kai wasn't like that. I think what really kind of hurt this book quite considerably is the fact that we didn't get a lot of points of view from Kai, whereas in The Kiss Quotient, the main character who had Asperger's disease, we had a ton of internal dialogue of things that were going on in her head. Felt like I was able to get more of a perspective on her in that book. I felt like I could not get that same perspective in this book because I was trying to understand what was going on in his head and what was going on with his perspective, but it was mostly told from Esme's perspective, and I didn't really get a good grasp on the story as far as from his perspective about what was going on inside his head during this. Now you do get some kind of glimpses, but they're all very sexual, and they're all very sexually oriented. There's not I didn't really feel a ton of actual emotional things going on, which I understand like that's part of Asperger's, but it would have been nice like to have more of a point of view from the character with Asperger's. Really felt like this didn't dig into Asperger's the way the Kiss Quotient did, and I really wanted more from this book. So while I did enjoy it, I didn't absolutely love it. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. It was still a good story. I still enjoyed reading it, but there was a lot for me like that really fell short because I kept thinking of how much I love the Kiss Quotient and how other things I wish this book had done that book really latched onto. So the next book that I read was also one of my most anticipated releases of 2019, and that was Middle Game by Sheena Maguire. This is a pretty thick book. This took me quite a while to get through. I did not rush this book. I could not rush this book. This book is a very extremely slow burn. You have to be very patient with this because there's a lot of like details that are very important to the plot line. This book is kind of like got alchemy and it's got science and it's a combination of a lot of different things. It's got time travel. I mean, there's so many different things like that this book encompasses. And you have this guy, James Reed, who is created by this very famous alchemist, and she wanted him to continue her work. She was looking for the doctrine of ethos. She was looking for people to embody the doctrine of ethos so that they could get closer to life itself. The doctrine of ethos is actually this thing that allows life to exist and it allows you to control life overall. And it's a really like interesting ability to have. So they've been searching for it through people, through twins specifically. So this one pair of twins, Roger and Dodger, this is not the first time that they've done this. This is just another generation that they're experimenting with, and they're using different variations to see where these two are going to end up. They end up putting these twins on opposite ends of the country with 2 different foster families to try to separate them, to get them to develop just enough so that they can establish themselves in those opposite frames. You have Roger, who is very into English and words, and he's very emotional. And then you have Dodger, who is on the complete opposite end of that spectrum, who's a math genius, and she can like measure things just by looking at them, but she lacks depth perception. Well, Roger is colorblind. One day, Roger's kind of just sitting around. He's about 7 years old, and next thing he knows, this person appears in his room that kind of looks a lot like him, and he's not like, really sure what's going on. There is this long distance connection between Roger and Dodger, and even in spite of the fact that they're on opposite ends of the country, they are still able to communicate. Well, this kind of sends an alarm to James Reed, who is the creator of the lab, and it's kind of ruining his experiment, so they have to figure out how to separate them again. This book actually takes place throughout, I want to say about 20, 30, 35 years, from the time that they're 7 till they're into adulthood, after like they've already graduated with their master's degree and are in their respective professions. And by this time, like they really develop, for one reason or another, like they end up getting separated. This was very rooted in alchemy, and it's very rooted in science, but it also has like this really fantastical, realistic element that you don't often see from a lot of books. And I really appreciate that because I felt like the magic was a lot more real and tangible. Sheena Maguire really stuck to trying to keep it as realistic as possible so that it felt like you were actually very much immersed in the story and that this is something that could actually happen in real life. And I really enjoyed this, but the fact that it was such a slow burn, as much as I really love this, felt like it was in such a lull for so long that the ending was over before I knew it. So actually, middle game is actually a chess vocabulary term, like where the beginning of the chess game doesn't really have a concrete definition between the beginning of it and the middle game, and then the middle game doesn't really have a concrete definition of the middle game and then the end game. So it does really encompass that very well. I see why she titled it that, but it wasn't everything that I wanted it to be. I was just hoping like that it would be like a little bit quicker for what it was. And I do understand like that there was a lot going into this. So being empathetic towards that, I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. So after my obsession with Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, I got really obsessed with his work. And I found that he had one more book that was, I think, published before Ready Player One that I also ended up listening to on audiobook because it was also narrated by Will Beaton. It's Armada by Ernest Cline. There's a huge difference between this and Ready Player One. They're both very much cemented in 80s pop culture, but this one's more focused on older video games, whereas that one was more focused on a broader array of pop culture. This being the fact that it was so focused on video games, it was good. I enjoyed it, but some of the video game portions of it were really hard for me to grasp. Zach Lightman is this kind of bored senior. He loves to play video games. He lost his father when he was really young, so it was just him and his mother, who's a nurse. One day he's in class and he sees this Armada ship out his window and he thinks he's losing it. He is a huge fan of Armada. He plays Armada all the time, and he's ranked, I think it was top 5 in Armada, and Armada is played internationally. I don't really want to say too much more about this because part of the wonder of this book, part of what was interesting about this book was the fact that I didn't know what was going to happen next, and I want the same thing for you if you decide to read this. My only thing is that because it was so firmly rooted in video games, there's so many different versions of Armada, and I kept trying to find the version of Armada that would best encompass this so I could get a better visual, because I've never actually played Armada before, but I couldn't find it. I wasn't really sure like what version of Armada this actually took place in, and so for me a lot of what was going on was extremely hard to visualize. Now he did a decent job describing the overall action sequences in this book, but I, especially at the beginning, really struggled with my mental visualization of the details. I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. So the next book that I read is Forever Interrupted by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I am participating in the Taylor Jenkins Read Along, and this was the first month that we did it. This is her very first book that she wrote, and we are reading all of Taylor Jenkins Reid's books in publication order. I'm going to leave a link down in the descriptions if you guys are interested. They do have a Twitter page. So this is about Ben and Elise. They meet each other, they're really in love. This starts off with them being married after only just over 5 months of meeting each other. And she ends up having a craving for Fruity Pebbles. So he goes out to get her Fruity Pebbles. It's just down the street, he's riding his bike, he shouldn't be gone long. Well, he's gotten a lot longer than she's comfortable with. So she goes out and she walks down the street like a little bit and she sees an ambulance and she freaks out. So she goes and she sees this bike underneath a semi and she freaks out, and this cop tells her, like, she asks like what happened, and she's like, you know, like, did you know him? And she's just like, well, I'm looking for Ben. Where's Ben? And she looked at the bike. She's like, he was on the bike. Like, where's Ben? And he says, I'm sorry, ma'am. He died on impact. So they'd only been married for about 11 days at this point. This is such a heart-wrenching story. This actually goes back and forth on an earlier timeline, earlier in the year when she first met Ben in January, and how she met him, and you know, like how like their entire relationship was, and it also takes place in the present, and it goes back and forth between those, and you really get to see her grief and how much she misses him. I thought like this made so many good points about grief. When you're grieving, you're not always the friendliest person, you're not always the most likable person, and even when Elise was super unlikable, I still really felt very empathetic towards her, because I have personally myself experienced a ton of loss in my life, and she was very self-destructive during this, and I felt myself like wanting to implode at times too when I have lost these people who are very important to me, because sometimes when you are grieving and you're grieving hard, sometimes you feel very guilty even though it wasn't your fault, even though you could not have done anything, you couldn't have stopped it, and you go through all these like instances of what if I did this wouldn't have happened, what if I, you know, like had made one different move, maybe I could have stopped this from happening, you know, maybe if I hadn't made a decision, and you go through like all of these things like that you completely try to justify, even though nothing you could do would change that. And I felt like she went through those motions, and I felt a lot for her. So I really liked how they captured that, but I also love the fact that they captured that it doesn't matter how long you love somebody, it doesn't mean that it's not real. And no matter how long you've had with them, you're always going to want more time. This touched on a lot of really good things regarding grief and love, and I really appreciated it. I have read her other 2 newest books, which is 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones and the Six. And this is for her first novel. I thought this was a very strong novel. I didn't think it was her strongest, so I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. I felt like it was a very good story, but I don't feel like it touched me emotionally like the way that Daisy Jones and the Six did and 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. But this still was very touching and very interesting, and I still really enjoyed this. This next book I have 2 different ratings for, because there is the regular story in this and then there is a short story in the back. This is V. Swabs' The Near Witch, and this was her very first book that she ever wrote, and it ended up getting taken out of publishing. They ended up discontinuing it, and then they brought it back. And I'm really glad they did, because I really enjoyed the story. If I was rating the story on enjoyment alone, I would have given it 4.5 stars. but there is a lot of little problems with the story, little holes that I was really kind of hung me up and took me out of the story. It's like a lot of kids getting taken, and something happened like in this town's history like that really affected the town itself, and it was kind of forgotten about, but now things are happening. They're coming back to bite them, so to speak, and you know, you don't really know like why suddenly this is happening. This entire story takes place in the little village of Near. Near is this really tight-knit town. Everybody knows everybody else. They don't like outsiders. Now, they're not anti-witch though. They have two witches that are sisters that live on the edge of Near that they're all very aware of, that live there and are not against them. I really like this story. Like, it kind of felt like a very classic fairy tale. It had like a very old English feel to it. It was a very interesting, fun read. I really like our main character, Lexi. Lexi's father had taught her how to track, and so she is very connected to the moors because she can sense a lot of things. Usually, the only people that are really connected to the moors are witches, but she has a little bit more of an ability because her father was also very connected to the world around him because he was an excellent tracker. One night, she gets up and she sees this guy standing out in the middle of the moors, and he is a stranger and she has never seen him before. Next thing you know, the next morning, there's rumors that these children have gone missing. Because these kids have gone missing, they start to look at the stranger that a few people had witnessed, and being the fact that they don't trust outsiders, they decide to blame him for it. Well, Lexi goes on these adventures because she's trying to track down who is taking these children. The first child that was taken was not the last child that was taken. She meets the stranger and she realizes it's not him. There's other stuff going on here. But the town does not believe it, so she's constantly at a rush for time trying to figure out who has taken these kids so that her new friend doesn't get blamed for these murders. I was very interested to see what was going to happen next. This is not the most fleshed out story that you will have. There's a lot of questions like that I had, and I had so many questions about Cole, our main, like the stranger that was in this town. I want to know more about his background. I didn't get that from the story itself. I ended up giving the story itself a 3.75 because there was a lot of holes. Now, on to the second story that was in here, which is called The Ashbourne Boy. The Ashbourne Boy is a short story that is circulating around a boy, and he is pretty much like considered a prince in his town. His mother and father actually own the town. His last name is Dale. He actually lives in the town of Dale, and I don't really want to say too much about this. This actually gave us Cole's background story, and I was really grateful for this because it really filled in a lot of like little things for me about him that I really wanted to know. I mean, Cole was one of my favorite characters from The Near Witch, so I kind of wanted to know more than what was expressed. And so I'm really grateful like that I had this short story. Being the fact that it's so short, if I say too much about it, it's going to ruin it for you. I really don't feel like you have to read The Near Witch or The Ashbourne Boy in any particular order. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind, like though, that there are some things about Cole that you learn in The Near Witch that you also learn in The Ashbourne Boy. So if you want to be surprised about Cole's character in The Near Witch, then you definitely don't want to read The Ashbourne Boy before you read The Near Witch. But if you don't really mind learning more about him, I feel like my experience could have gone either way. I feel like I could have had a richer experience with that character in The Near Witch had I read The Ashbourne Boy first. I think what's really going to be dependent on like which order you read them in, because it is considered 0.5 in The Near Witch series because it is technically a prequel to The Near Witch. I think depending on what your preference is, you could read either story in whatever order you decide. Alright guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you guys like this video, hit the little like, hit subscribe, and hit the little bell icon if you want to receive emails every time I post. I am also on Amazon, Twitter, Instagram, and Goodreads. Those links are linked in the description below. And thank you guys so much for joining me. Likes really help me. Subscribes really help me, and I'm glad that you guys joined me for this. And if you guys like this video, please continue watching my other ones. I will see you guys again very soon.